privileges. Okay, fantastic. All right, so I think we can get started. So today it's my real pleasure to have two wonderful presentations. We're gonna have Laura Fujita, as you can see here, she's from PUCRS, and she's gonna be speaking about the spatial distribution and dissemination of education in Brazilian municipalities. And right after Laura, we're going to move from Brazil to Spain with Professor Andres Rodriguez Pose, who's going to also tell us more about his latest research. And I think there is no need for me to remind everyone that Andres works at the London School of Economics. So Laura, whenever you're ready, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. So, hello, my name is Laura. Good morning to everyone. In the first place, I want to apologize for my pronunciation. So today I present the paper that was developed by me, Professor Izette, that is here too, and Professor Adelar Focasato. The title of the paper is Spatial Distribution and Dissemination of Education in Brazilian Municipalities. So the idea of this paper become through the results that we found in one paper in 2015 that we studied the determinants of educational achievement, and we identified that looking on a more great way, we can identify the characteristics of teachers, principals, and schools also have impact in the school performance of the students. Not only the background, the familiar background. So, beside that, we also found that the regions the students belongs also affect their achievement. So in this case, we want to study more clearly how the education behaves in the regions. For that, we choose to use the spatial models that are widely used in the literature, but is more in economic growth, human capital, weights, productivity, weights. In the field of the education, these instruments are more usually mainly to stock of education, like that. Sorry, my English. No. The years of schooling. So we want to use the instrument, the spatial model, to understand how the quality of education behaves, how is the performance in the regions. For that, we will use the spatial models, and we focus on the proficiency, on the grades of the students, to understand how this behaves through the regions. So the paper aims to investigate the spatial effect of the quality of human capital and to identify if there is educational spillover from the higher education in the proficiency of elementary students. Here we can see more clearly. The proficiency, we want to see first if the proficiency of elementary students in one region affect the proficiency of elementary students in other regions, the other Brazilian municipalities. Besides that, we want to test if the higher education have some impact on the proficiency of elementary students. We have some hypotheses here that better performance institutions of higher education provides better teachers. Better higher educations provides better students that also became teachers. So when we focus in the students that are the teacher training, we can have in the future better grades of the students in the school. So we want to test if the higher education has impact on better higher education have impact on the proficiency of elementary students in the same region, also in the neighboring region. So for that we use two databases, both to the 5,507 Brazilian municipalities. And the period that we study is between 2008 and 2013. For the schools, we use the database civic. That is a test that show the proficiency of the students on mathematics, Portuguese, science, and other disciplines. So we have the exam proficiency that range from 0 to 500. And also we have questionnaires that are applied to the principals, teachers, and the students. So we have socioeconomic information, we have some information about how is the school, the teachers, their schooling, etc. So this information from the school we use it from the 2013. Here, from the point of view of the higher institution education, we use the Enequality, is another database. In the year that we use is 2008. We have some time legend here because we want that the people, the undergraduates, have the grade and after became teachers to have some effect on the school students. So the time lag is for that. And the Enequality is also exam that shows a proficiency that ranges from 0 to 5. In Brazil, some curiosity. In Brazil, we have more than 5,000 Brazilian municipalities, but only 739 have the high institutions education. So here we can see the maps that show us the distribution of the school education and the higher education. Here, the blue one, we can see the distribution of the grades of the students on the school. We can see in the southwest we have more concentrated better grades. Also in the south of Brazil, but in the northeast we don't have so good grades like in the south and southwest. Here, looking to the higher education, we can see the same pattern. We can see more scattered. We don't have the concentration of better performance high institutions. So except here that we don't have higher institution educations because it's the Amazon region, so we don't have a lot of cities here. Okay, our methodology is the special Derby model. So we can test the effect of the dependent variable in the municipality, also in the neighboring regions. And we can see how the explanatory variables performs in the same municipality and also the neighboring municipality.
I'm gonna have another 9:30 in 20 minutes. Wow. Yeah.
So we have 4 models. We estimate 4 models. They are quite similar. The difference between them is some change in the schooling of parents and the study of the schooling of the teacher. So our first model shows the education school. So here we have the performance of the education, the students on school. So their grades on Enequality, on civic. Here is the effect of the higher education, the color of the students, the sex of the students. Those variables are the same in the other models. And we have also the mother schooling and father schooling, and if the teacher has post-graduation. Besides that, in this model 2, we change the post-graduation to the teacher effort. So here we don't look exactly to if he has or not the post-graduation, but if he encourage their students to do their homework, if he corrects the homework, etc. And the other variables are the same. In the model 3, we also changed the schooling of mother and father to their stimulus. So if the father's stimulus encourage their children to go to the school, to do their homework, to read, etc. And the last one, we used also the teacher effort and the stimulus of the father, the father and the mother. So the variables are that we told, but the school performance, what we use is the municipal average performance in mathematics that ranges from 0 to 500. In the higher education performance, we use the municipal average performance in energy. Mother and father schooling, we use the proportions of mother and fathers with high school. The sex, skin color, the proportion with male pupils and white pupils. Post-graduation training is the proportion of the teacher with post-graduation training. Teacher effort, proportion of the hardworking teachers. And parental stimulus, the proportions of parents that encourage their children. So there are our results, and in the first place, I want to show you the result that we found to the higher education. So we found a positive and significant effect from the higher education to the school education. But when we look about the neighboring, we didn't find this effect. So don't have the spillover from the higher education to the school education. So we have just on local level. Looking to the information of the mother and father, like the literature, we have a positive and significant effect. Also, when we look to their stimulus to the children, we have a positive effect on the model 3, but we don't have the effect on the model 4. Looking to the teacher, we also have positive and significant effect to the post-graduation and to the teacher effort. And I think it is the more important variable that is the focus of our work, is to identify if there is spillover from school education to school education. So we have the spatial effect. There is positive and significant, indicating that the better grades in some municipalities are related to better grades in other municipalities. So when we look to the spatial effect of education, we can see it only at school level. When we look to the higher education level, we can see this effect. And the other variables is related to the explanatory of the neighboring municipalities. So in conclusion, the study identified a strong spatial dependence, indicating that the spatial structure influences the quality of education. And related to the higher education, our main hypothesis that better performance produce better qualified teachers, and thus would be associated better grades in school, but it was only confirmed at the local level. And however, to our expectations, this positive local effect does not cross municipal boundaries. So I want to thank you for the listening, and I'm open to questions.
All right, Laura, thank you so much for your very interesting talk. So I have a few comments for you, which are mostly based on the technique per se, much less on the topic. So my first one is related to the choice of that weight matrix here. I did not really catch which one you chose, but I would like to also, no matter what choice you make at the end of the day, I would like to simply indicate that you may want to try to find ways to justify economically the actual W matrix you choose, such as, for instance, the distance of commuting between people across all different municipalities. So make sure that you make that very clear at some point. My second comment is related to the choice of that spatial Durbin model that comes up a little bit abruptly, in my view. All of a sudden you say, oh, this is the choice I will make. I have nothing against that specific model, and it may indeed be the best choice. I have no problem with that, but you may want to really justify why it is that at the end of the day, this is the specification you're going to be working on. If you follow a bit the strategy that James Lesage is recommending to basically end up with a spatial Durbin model, you will see that he's actually using some test, a Haussmann test actually, to really verify if there is some kind of correlation between your error terms and one of your explanatory variable, and your error terms are indeed spatially autocorrelated, which is true in this case, will make the SDM as the best choice. And then the final comment I have for you is that for any of the models you work on where you do have the spatial lag of your dependent variable, so WY, so even if it's a spatial lag model or SDM, it is true. The way you should present the result is so that you really disentangle what are called the direct and the indirect effect. So it's once again a contribution by Lesage and his colleague James Pace. But so that really is a coefficient to interpret at the end of the day. Because if you look at those beta coefficient and you still report the raw coefficient of spatial autocorrelation, some of the marginal effect of your x's are actually embedded into the measurement of your rho. So if you want, because I've worked on those questions for quite a while, I'm very happy to send you all the codes in R. This is what I program with, in order to give you a better sense of how to make that happen. It's not very difficult at the end of the day, but I think it will really make the paper and the interpretation of the results much more consistent with what the literature is currently doing. Okay, so don't hesitate to send me an email, Laura, and I will forward you all my codes anytime. Why don't we open the floor for more questions and comments for Laura?
Laura, Jeff Hewing said, thank you for a very nice presentation. One thing I think would be very helpful for people who are not familiar with Brazil would be to give us a sense of the degree of mobility of people once they receive their higher education. And do you have a sense that there may be sort of spatial enclaves where people tend to live, they go to higher education, and they remain in that community? And as a result, are you not getting some sort of endogenous process which may be limiting or curtailing the ability to, for example, to raise standards, as opposed to a case where Andres lives in the United Kingdom, where there's a great deal of mobility from one part of the country to another. We're dealing with a much, much smaller country, of course. And so as a result of this, could you perhaps think about this in terms of looking at spatial clusters, perhaps putting in a test to see whether behavior in the Northeast is really statistically significantly different from Sao Paulo, Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that might give us some notion about the degree to which those markets are much more self-contained than they might be in other parts of the country. But this is sort of really interesting stuff. And the final comment is perhaps doing some tests about the lag between the higher education. You've got 2008, and then you look at outcomes in 2013, and you might want to test to see whether a lag of 5 years, 8 years, or 10 years might be appropriate. Thank you very much.
So Andres, I see that you have put some comments. Why don't you simply convey your comments to Laura?
Okay, yes, no, I didn't know how it worked. So thank you very much. And thank you very much, Laura, for a very Very nice presentation. Just a question for clarification. I was very interested in your measurement of teacher effort and the measurement of the stimulus by parents. How is this measured? Does it come from a survey? And how can you extract the effect, for example, in the case of the stimulus by fathers and mothers, from you already measured whether the fathers and mothers have got higher education? How do you get those two or disentangle those two factors from one another?
Laura, would you like to answer? Or?
Sure. I have here also the professor Izette to help, because my English is very bad. Sorry, but let me see if you understand. Sandy asked about the metrics where what we use it. So we use, sorry to not explain this on the presentation, I tried to be very on time. So we use the one nearest neighboring from the matrix, the metrics. The second commentary is about from Sandy is about the model that we chose that spatial model, the spatial Derby model. Why we choose this model? So we check the I don't know how to speak in English, but Hausmann test. We did it. We test the whole and other variables, and these tests indicate to use the spatial Derby model.
Very good. Okay, good.
Sorry we have this, but I try to be very quickly.
That's okay.
And also the third comment, I don't know if is that exactly what did you said.
Oh, so yeah, the last comment is when you report your result, you obviously focus on those beta coefficients, but at the very bottom, you also report that rho coefficient. So it turned out that in their book of 2009, James Lesage and Kelly Pace have offered a way of basically disentangling the total direct effect from the indirect effect. So the direct being really location X is being shocked and it has an effect on Y in location X, whereas the indirect one being basically anything outside of your own locality that will affect you. I will send you the code in your way, because at the end of the day, those are the actual beta to present and to interpret. So what you did is not wrong. It's just, it's not the complete story. You got like to 98%, basically. You just have that one additional step, but otherwise it is great. Why don't you take a moment to answer the questions of Jeff and Andres, if you want to answer them.
Okay. Those to that last comment, I will appreciate the comment, and we will think about that and appreciate the comments also. Thank you. About the questions of Professor Hewings is about the degree mobility. If the students of the professors of higher educations stay on, if you have the information, if they stay here on their municipality, is that?
Yes, it's about that. In that case, I think we have two different situations. Sorry, good morning, everyone. We have the situation of the higher education students that are getting the degree on teacher training and math and Portuguese, for example, that they mainly stay in the same municipality or close municipality. However, when they are going to look for a job, many of them are looking for public places for public jobs, and they apply and are assigned for the municipality according to the classification on the score they got in the concurso, how can I say, the selective process. And so many of the students that are from a municipality, and when they apply for a job, they move to work in a different municipality due to the classification on the selective process. So we have mobility in the teachers, but not in the higher, smaller in the higher education universe that they get the degree. I'm not sure if I answered that properly, but it would be interesting to test that in the model, if they better move more or not, but that we didn't take into account.
Okay, do you want to briefly answer Andres' comment?
Sure. About Andres' comment, how we measure the parental stimulus and teacher effort, right? So just let me open here. First, Professor Hillenstein asked about the cluster. We have here the cluster on the southwest of Brazil of high education too. Let me show you the questions that we use to determine the parental stimulus. In the are you seeing? I think so. We have the five questions on the questionnaire that on SAEB. That is, how often do your parents attend the parents' meetings? Do your parents encourage you to study? Do your parents encourage you to do the homework and assignments? Encourage you to read and to attend school and not miss classes? So we use these 5 questions that the students answered on the databases, and we first make some dummies to understand yes or no, and after we make the proportion of this information to show us the parental stimulus. I think, and about the teacher, if they have some effort, the question was to the teacher if they correct their frequently their homework, and if he explained the errors, I don't know exactly how to say. What was they don't
give feedbacks about the homework and activities.
So we use those questions to make dummies and proportions on the municipalities to do these variables. I don't know if it was clear or not.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Look, we have 3 more minutes. Why don't we collect one more question or comment from the participants? Well, if they're silent, that's okay then. They can always send it to you later on. So Laura, Izete, thank you so much for the presentation and very interesting work. We are going to move from Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil to go to Madrid, Spain. And Professor Andres Rodriguez Pose from the London School of Economics is going to show us something with such an intriguing title. I think here, Andres, you really win the prize for the most intriguing title, Golfing with Trump, Social Capital, Decline, Inequality, and the Rise of Populism in the US. You may have to redo entirely your paper now that we know the result of the elections, Andres. Let's see. It's all yours. We can see your presentation. Whenever you want is good.
I have to unmute myself. So thank you very much, Sandy. I don't think that I'm going to have to redo my title and the paper now that we have the results of the elections. We got a win for Biden, and I think, well, I'm very happy about that. That's my own personal view, and very much relieved. But one of the things that came to a surprise for all was the actual small margins in which the win happened that no one expected. The polls were in many cases predicting a landslide for Biden, and then here we are with a victory in Arizona by about 10,000 votes, a victory in Georgia by about 15,000 votes, in Wisconsin by 20,000 votes, and in Pennsylvania by 60,000 votes. So it has gone to the wire, meaning that the problem that drove Trump to the election in 2016 it still remains, despite the fact that the elections in 2020 have returned Joe Biden presidency. So what I'm going to try to highlight is a very topical topic, and something that might return is, why do we have this rise of anti-system voting? How could the United States in 2016 elect and almost re-elect in 2020 a president that was completely anti-system, that in many cases can be considered as a populist, and someone that has gone against all conventions within political parties in the US, someone who was elected against the will of the elite of the Republican Party and won the presidency against all odds. And in order to do that, let me just go back with a prediction that was made 20 years ago by one of the most prominent social scientists in the US and in the world, and this is Robert Putnam. And in Robert Putnam in the year 2000 wrote the book Bowling Alone, which is one of the seminal books, one of the most cited books in social science in this century, if not the most cited. And in his theory, in that book, it was this idea that Americans were going to bowling alleys no longer to play in with a bowling club in bowling leagues against other people, but they were going alone, was a metaphor for this decline of civic engagement and social capital in the case of the US that had become prevalent since the mid-1960s. In a country like the US that was built on civic engagement, political participation, helping one another, Americans were increasingly playing one of the traditional sports they had played with friends, were playing alone. And this wane in bowling was an indication, was a metaphor for all sorts of civic engagement and social trust. If you read the book by Putnam, he describes very clearly that it's not just that Americans are participating in collective sports much less than before, but there has been a decline in political participation, in voter turnout, in newspaper readership, in personal letter writing, union membership, but also in things like social visiting, card playing, volunteering, or even church attendance. And that represents a significant change with respect to what was happening before and has happened in parallel to a similar transformation, a similar decline, which has been the rise in interpersonal inequality that starts taking place at more or less the same time. Putnam says that sometime around 1965 to 1970, America reversed course, and that inequality has become the norm, that few people are gaining the most, whereas the majority seem to be losing out, reversing a trend that was the post-war trend towards greater equality. So this combination of inequality and social capital represents, according to Trump, represented the biggest threat to not just the economy, but also to American democracy. And the question is, was he right? Was he right in making this prediction? And what I'm going to try to argue that Putnam was possibly right. The election of Donald Trump, this anti-system president, and we are seeing it now, represented a threat to America's democratic health. The fact that he's not conceding is the biggest and most clear indication of that, although there are many other examples. But I'm going to argue that this didn't come from the sort of arguments that Putnam was put forward, that it has not been a decline in social capital together with interpersonal inequality, or the combination that has been the driver of this rise in anti-system vote and this rise in populism, but it has been something that no one was expecting, which is the long-term, and although it has been there, but it has been under the radar for quite some time, the long-term economic and demographic decline of American towns and rural areas, and of course, the related rise in interterritorial inequality in combination, and this is interesting, in contrast to what Putnam was saying, with remnants of relatively strong social capital rather than weaker social capital, which are leading to a geography of resentment or politics of resentment. If you take the words of Kathy Kramer in her book about Wisconsin, not far away from where you are, this rise of the geography of discontent that has been promoted in Europe by Phil McCann, and to what I called in a paper that has made some waves, this revenge of places that have been told, have been neglected, and have been told that they don't matter, that where, using the words of Hillary Clinton, a lot of people that are despicable actually live. So let me start, and I'm going to go quickly because I know I have not much time, but was the prediction fulfilled? And this is the map of the vote for Donald Trump and the swing to Donald Trump, which is the one I'm going to be using in my work in the 2016 election. It would be also interesting to take a look at the swing between the vote for Mitt Romney in 2012 and the swing to Donald Trump in 2020. And I haven't done it. I'll do it as soon as I get the data, as soon as the results are confirmed in all the states. But I think that there would be no changes in the results I'm going to present here. The question is why? Why did it happen? Why did a candidate that came out of the blue, that was not a professional politician, but had clear, let's say, populistic tendencies and populist discourse, managed to get elected on the basis, on the back of the votes of an arc of voters that are located around the Great Lakes, all the way from northern Maine to North Dakota, outside the big cities, in places that have seen better times and have experienced long-term economic decline. And there are several explanations. The first one is going back to, let's take the Trump sort of arguments, erosion of social capital, this idea that America has been pulling away from civic engagement that is happening everywhere, and the fact that this is something that is eroding democratic institutions because people in the US have got less political participation, less civic engagement. And there has been maps of Robert Putnam's measurement of social capital. They have been conducted on the basis of his definition of social capital, which is linked to a lot of associationism in the US. They are done at the University of Pennsylvania by people like Rupashinga and followers. And you can see the distribution. There's a big difference in terms of that type of social capital across the US, where you have very low levels of social capital, especially in the Southwest, all the way from the Southern California, throughout Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, but also in the South, and especially in states like Kentucky, Eastern Tennessee, where there's less social capital, lower social capital, and in also the big cities. You can hardly see it here, but Chicago and surrounding area, Los Angeles, San Francisco, New York are areas where you have low endowments of social capital relative to the rest of the US. You have much greater endowments in places like, for example, states of the Midwest, rural Illinois, where you are at the moment, or many of you might be or have been, Wisconsin, all the way through the Great Plains, into the mountain states, through the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, into Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, and Eastern Oregon. Second explanation is interpersonal inequality, which of course is not something that Putnam highlighted, that has been documented by the work of Raj Shetty, Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, Branko Milanovic. It has been not just in the US, in most of the Western world, and also it has been increasingly linked to the rise of populism in the work of people have focused on the rise of economic insecurity, the work by Wiesel, for example, the China syndrome, Autor, or the social status by vulnerable individuals like Gitron and Hall. In this respect, we have a bigger share of people falling into poverty or at risk of being into poverty, and it has been promoted by some, Branko Milanovic, that this idea that you have more people that have become vulnerable, that are rejecting the status quo and are leading to this erosion of democratic institutions and to greater nativism and plutocracy. And then there's the map here in which we take a look at the interpersonal inequality, and we see a very different geography from that of social capital, which might in a certain way go in the direction that Putnam was highlighting. instead of having areas where you have a strong social capital, you tend to have lower interpersonal inequality. You can see the arc, the Rust Belt, the Midwest, and the Great Plains states and mountain states, where you have, in general, lower inequality than in most places in the South. Big levels of inequality in many counties in Louisiana, in Mississippi, in Arkansas, in Alabama, also in Eastern Kentucky, which was notorious by its low level of social capital, and also very high inequality in the cities. So you can see Los Angeles County, you can see the Bay Area, you can see Chicago isolated in an area where this has got relatively low levels of interpersonal inequality, and also New York and Boston that stand out, Baltimore as well over there. And then it might be the combination of both, as Putnam was saying. Once you have the situation, you have on the one hand, a lot of people that are falling into this vulnerable trap and a decline in social capital. Then you can go and you might have the perfect cocktail for discontent, and that is translated at the ballot box. However, one of the things that I'm going to highlight is that probably Putnam forgot one of the most important type of declines. So it's funny because Putnam's work is about declining virtually everything: social capital, civic engagement, voter turnout, card playing, church going, blood donation, whatever you name it. But he forgets, he barely mentions the whole idea of the decline of Midtown and rural America. The number of communities that were very often industrial dynamic communities, the communities that made America in a certain way, in places like Ohio, in places like Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, that have been declining for quite some time, to the benefit of cities that have been much more dynamic and have been attracting talent for quite some time. And what I'm going to be argued that in the US, this term of decline, very long-term decline, is not just a question of the COVID crisis or a question of the 2008 financial crisis, but it's a much longer, deeply rooted type of process, is driving this rejection of the established system, rejection of established elites, and the drive towards anti-system populist voting in the case of the US. And it's very similar to what we have witnessed in the case of Europe, or in the case of the US, in the work of McCann, in the case of Europe, in the work I've been doing with Louis Dijkstra and Hugo Pullman on the rise of EU discontent. And that has been described in the US by Kathy Kramer when she looked at the politics of resentment in Wisconsin, and more recently in the division between urban and rural areas by Jonathan Rodden at the University of Stanford. So what is the long-term decline? I have several measurements of long-term decline. I look at population decline, employment decline, salaries, decline in salaries and declines in wages, and in income as well. And what we find is that there's a big, for example, taking one, looking at almost 40 years, 36 years before the election of employment change at counties in the US. And we then again have a very different geography. Employment has grown in the US where you think it has grown in the big cities, but mainly in the axis of the Pacific coast, in the Northeast, all the way from Washington to in the megalopolis to Boston. A third pole, an important pole, is the area of Southern Florida. And you can see in other places, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, but also around Lake Michigan in the counties that are really on the shore of the lake, not when you go inland. By contrast, you have this phenomenal axis going all the way from Montana, North Dakota, all the way to Western Texas, in which jobs growth has been over a period of 30 years, actually very, very, very small. So when we put all this, let me just put it in a model. I don't have a lot of time, so I'm not going to highlight, put it in Greek letters, although perhaps given the audience actually have done it, but I'm going to do it in a simple icon way. There's a paper around. If you're interested, I'll send you the paper so you can take a look at it. It was published well before the election. So in that respect, I think the results have been somewhat vindicated, in which what we analyze, and I say we because it's, although I've been saying I, is work that has been done with my colleague Neil Lee and Cornelius Lip, a former student What we look is at the Trump margin, what we call the Trump margin, which is the swing towards Donald Trump in votes from the votes that got the previous Republican candidate for the presidency in 2012, Mitt Romney, a perfectly mainstream, let's say, Republican candidate and an experienced politician. And we have three variables of interest. We assume that the swing, based on the work that has been, the ideas that were proposed by Putnam, would be related to levels of social capital, to levels of inequality, and the third dimension that I am highlighting, which is long-term economic and demographic decline measured by population, income, wages and salaries, and employment. And then, of course, we control for a number of factors that might be affecting changes and swing in the vote towards populism that are very much associated to what everyone is saying that determines this type of votes. Race at county level, levels of education, levels of wealth, density, and we have a narrow term. So the question is, I'll probably skip this once because I realize I have about 5 minutes, but I just want to highlight that very much there's no individual factor that is strongly associated to the swing towards Donald Trump in 2016, as I suppose there will be none associated to the swing in 2020. You can see that the links between inequality and Trump, and the Trump margin, and social capital and the Trump margin, the regression lines are virtually flat. There's a negative slope or slight negative slope in the relationship between employment change and the Trump margin, but very much is very limited, and there are a lot of outliers there. There's also virtually no connection between the three independent variables of interest between employment change, social capital, and inequality. And you can see, again, the regression lines are relatively flat. So what do we get? And again, I'm going to icons, looking at first, before I go into my variables of interest, I'm going to highlight that the results for the control variables are what everyone expected. In counties where you have a higher percentage of white population, or you have a lower percentage of minority or Black people who control for different groups of race compositions in the US, you get a significantly higher swing towards Trump. Also in areas with lower levels of education, you get a significant swing towards Trump. In poorer areas, you have more swing towards Trump, and in areas especially with lower density. Education, density, and race are the three factors that seem to be driving, to a big extent, the swing towards populism in the case of the US. But what about, so in that respect, it all works. What about our variables of interest? So what we find is that there are two factors that seem to be driving the rise or the swing towards Donald Trump across counties in the US. The first one is what we predicted, which is long-term economic or population decline. We're going to see that it's not all types of population decline. It's demographic decline, population decline, and employment decline. But it's not in the case, it doesn't happen in the case of income or salaries and wages, which are completely unconnected to that. So the factors that are much more collective rather than the individual factors are the ones that seem to have given Trump the presidency. And this is in combination with social capital. But you can see that my balls here are upside down because it's opposite to what Trump was predicting, is not in the places with weak social capital, but in those places with strong social capital. So maybe social capital has acted as a catalyst in those places that have been declining for a very, very long time of the swing of determining that communities swing together towards Donald Trump because they act together, they go bowling together. By contrast, we get that the rise in interpersonal inequality within counties is not connected in any way to the swing towards Donald Trump. And this is in line with evidence that it has been coming from the analysis that in the United States in the 2016 election, and it's likely to have happened in the same way in the 2020 election, the richest of the rich, let's say the white, highly skilled living in the suburbs of Western Philadelphia, are voting for the same candidates together with the poorest of the poor, like, for example, the Black population and minority population living in the ghettos of northern Philadelphia. We also, if we move one down, we have checked for different types of decline, and we find, as I mentioned before, that it's employment decline and population decline that drive the swing towards Trump. By contrast, income decline and decline in salaries and wages, or relative decline, is completely disconnected. And this is something that is not new. It's something that is enduring and has been enduring over time. So we have a long-term control of these factors. And we look at the change between 1970 and 2016, 1980 and 2016, 1990 and 2016, and so on. And we get that the coefficients for relative employment decline and population decline are always connected to an increase in the Trump margin. By contrast, income change or relative income decline and decline in wages and salaries is not connected in any case, in any of the analysis that we have done. It's all in the paper if you're interested in this. So what can we conclude from this? Well, we have to take stock. There has been this situation that the United States has witnessed, like many parts of the Western world, and permanent polarization, both in terms of interpersonal polarization and increasingly in interterritorial polarization. In the case of the US, much more than in Europe, what you have is that interterritorial polarization has been stronger, interpersonal polarization has been stronger than interterritorial polarization. That in contrast to Europe, you have significantly higher interpersonal inequalities and relatively low interterritorial inequalities. But despite that, it's the territorial inequalities that seem to be one of the key drivers, rather than at the moment interpersonal inequalities, of the rise of anti-system voting in the US. I'm not saying that interpersonal inequalities are unimportant. And we have seen in the reaction to the killing of George Floyd that it's highlighting internal differences and internal polarization within American society. And that might set American cities and perhaps European cities alight in the future. Let's hope it's not the case. But nevertheless, it hasn't been the one that has been triggering the change so far. It's far more the decline of American communities, the decline of these places that have been seen far better times, that have been very often neglected and dismissed by people like Hillary Clinton as deplorables, living in places with names that say it all, like the Rust Belt, or in flyover states, or have been dismissed as rednecks that have decided enough is enough, and they are exacting their revenge at the ballot box, and they have done it, and they are doing it. They almost did it, and they're likely to continue doing it, because also in that respect, you have seen that the votes for Congress have not changed or have not given any significant change. So what I'm going to say is that Americans from these areas, from long-term declining areas with strong social capital, are no longer bowling alone. But they are, because Trump doesn't bowl, he plays golf, they're golfing with Trump. And you might say, well, they're no longer going to golf with Trump, but you're going to see that the United States, for the next 4 years or more, they're going to be golfing with Trumpism. And these communities are likely, and these voters, to continue to play golf or ball or whatever sort of a football or a soccer or ice hockey or baseball with whichever candidate is perceived to pay more attention to their plights and to reverse their neglect they have been suffering, and even the perceived disdain from mainstream decision makers that have fundamentally focused on the potential development of those areas that had the greatest opportunities, which are often associated to American large cities. And I'm going to leave it there. And if you're interested in the paper, you can get the paper available here. It's also available in different sites. So send me an email and I'll send you the link to the paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre. Very interesting, very insightful as always. And you're absolutely right. Even if Trump has been ousted, I think that his print on the US country, US economy, US politics is not going to disappear anytime soon. A few questions for you, because your point is very well taken, and you know, someone with the same kind of views of the world may come back and hunt us in US politics in a few years down the line. So we ought to study those processes much more carefully. In my views, one of the reasons why we ended up being in a situation we are at is that there are some American particularities that you don't really see elsewhere in the world. It's true that you've drawn a parallel with the increase in extreme right in some countries in Europe, but yet in my view, there are still some American characteristics that you do not see anywhere else. So for instance, when looking at the subnational level, which is really the focus of your analysis, it seems to me that one of the elements quite major that actually led to the election of Trump is the fact that in the US, we are not voting with a one man, one vote like we do in Western Europe. You have those weighting schemes that I think few people fully understand, that basically allocate much more power relatively to the size of the population to small states. And that to some extent has contributed largely to the success of Trump in the US and to that closeness of elections in the current year. Another element which, in my views, is extremely American, you don't necessarily see elsewhere in the world, and certainly not in Western Europe, but more difficult to grab in your analysis because there are more national level elements, is that the cost of higher education in the US is quite large relatively to what you see in Western Europe. So as a result, it seems to me a lot of people who are indeed supporting the views of Trump are people who are feeling left out, don't necessarily get great job because on the first place, they simply could not afford to get a master thesis or a degree. The US tax system is very special too, obviously taxing income much more than funds that you make on a stock exchange market. The length of the political process in the US is quite unbelievable. If I remember well, I think in the UK, and it's pretty similar to France, between the time that a candidate declares themselves as candidate and the elections end, we're looking at roughly 3 months. In the US, by the time a president is finally elected, you just cannot stand anymore to hear every single day about politics. So people are just really fed up. The US politics also are based on a system by which there is no limit as to how much money can be spent into advertisement and support of the candidates. I do not think we have anything quite similar to that in Western Europe. And my final point, which I think also kind of support your views, is that the social net in the US is almost inexistent. I think that people years ago missed the opportunity to be voting for a healthcare system that will be somewhat more socialized, the Obamacare. And now that COVID has been basically killing hundreds of thousands of people in the US, people realize that eventually they should have decided to do something quite different years ago when they were given the opportunity to basically be given an affordable healthcare system. So in my views, it's really a combination of many elements. You really highlighted so many of them. But there are on top of that some American specificities, which unfortunately are so hard to address. I don't even know if the new administration will want to go this route. It's a drenching process, I believe. What do you think, Andres?
Okay, so thank you very much, Sandy. I think that's a set of very, very interesting questions. And of course, you all know the US, many of you know Europe, some of you are from Europe. So the US and Europe are very, very different. But here I'm going to be the devil's advocate. Despite that, there are many of the differences that you have highlighted, and I'll go to that. The amazing factor is that the results and the tendencies are very, very much the same. And I'm going to argue things. I mean, we find, I did the analysis with Louis Dijkstra and Hugo Pullman for the European Union with 64,000 electoral districts, and we get exactly the same results. I mean, there are differences. In Europe, the decline, the most important decline is vote for anti-system parties is linked to industrial decline and decline in income, whereas in the case of the US is population decline and decline in employment, which are not connected in Europe, and that might be linked to the safety net. So, but nevertheless, I'm going to go over your explanations to see how they might not be that different. Of course, the electoral systems are different. The processes are longer in the US. Here in Britain, when there's an election and someone loses, the prime minister is kicked out immediately, and then someone comes in the next day, which is not, it doesn't happen in France, or it doesn't happen in Spain, for example, or in Italy, but nevertheless, the processes are faster, and that might have an impact. The electoral system with the electoral college represents a factor which is fundamental. It's a first past the post. It's a first past the post that is different from the case of the UK, and in many European countries, we have proportional systems. But of course, you mentioned one thing that is very, I would highlight, which is that in the US, one person is not equal to one vote, and all votes are not counted equal. I would argue that virtually everywhere that's the case, although albeit with different levels, apart from perhaps truly proportional systems for the whole country, like in the case of Israel. But in a case like Spain, a vote in a rural province like the province of Soria that has 90,000 inhabitants is worth 4.5 times the vote of someone who is from Madrid, which is the largest province in terms of population in Spain. And even with very different processes, first past the post led to the election of Trump with electoral college, which is a big distortion, led to the election of Trump. First past the post led to the election of Boris Johnson in the case of the UK, but you have proportional systems in the case of Hungary, in the case of Greece, in the case of Poland, and in the case of Italy, that have given and have returned populist governments. And you have mixed systems in the case of France, where President Marine Le Pen is no longer something that would be unexpected as it would have been considered 5 to 15 years ago. Then you're also you're highlighting the question of limits with money and the capacity to expand massively. Here, the irony is that in the last election, support for Democratic candidates has been far greater, if we take a look at the lists and the numbers that have come, than support for Republican candidates. And even then, many Republican candidates for Congress, despite what many of us would think have been a disgracious 4 years of a Trump presidency, very, and you mentioned that, not very good use or not very efficient handling of the pandemic. I think probably one of the worst that you can see. Despite all that and having more money, the Democratic Party has not managed to make the inroads that were expected. And then the final question that you have raises the safety net. And I would say that this phenomenon is happening in the US without a safety net, where the welfare system is far weaker than the one we have in Europe, but it's also happening in Europe with a stronger safety net. Highlighting that the safety net, the sort of thing that is being proposed by people like Ed Glazer or Larry Summers in the recent paper saying, oh my God, we have elected Donald Trump. We need to do this something for these declining areas. Otherwise, we might end up in a situation where our institutions keep on deteriorating. So we need to subsidize people on a more or less permanent basis, something that the US has not done. Unfortunately, this is something that we have tried in Europe. The south of Italy has been massively subsidized since the 1950s, the north of England, the northeast of France, coinciding Wallonia. And despite that, these are areas that have turned massively towards a liberal and anti-system parties. So I would argue that the welfare net is necessary, but it's necessary for other reasons. What we need in order to combat that is to create policies that would promote, that would mobilize the true economic potential of many of these areas in order to make sure that there are the capacity to create jobs, to create opportunities in areas where opportunities have been missing, in order to make sure that this dangerous slide towards something that is probably worse, much worse than what we have, and we know from experience, is not going to happen. It's not going to happen in a massive scale in the Western world.
Very good point. Why don't we collect more comments and questions for Andres?
Andres, this is Jeff Hewings. Thank you.
I can hear you, but I cannot see you. I recognize your voice. So.
Oh, okay. It's probably better the latter.
Come on, you're a good-looking lad. But anyway, fine.
I just, in the interest of time, just want to raise a couple of things that I think you might want to consider. I think that over the period in which you've been studying, there's been a dramatic change in the role of media. And you've seen an erosion of local newspapers, for example, being replaced by much more global sources, so that what gets delivered to individual communities is much more homogeneous. But I think even more important is the role of television. And in the US, they changed the rules so that you did not have to invite candidates from both parties to give equal time, and you could be 100% biased. So you've got the rise of things like the Fox News in the US and Sky News, I think it is in the UK. And I think this is really having an amazing impact, and they're 24 hours. They've got to find something to say. And what they have learned is to product differentiate themselves by essentially fomenting this anger and trying to keep that stuff going. That, I think, is very, very different from the effectiveness that occurred in the 1980s. The second issue that I think you might want to explore is the decline in mobility. And Partridge and Rickman had a paper that showed that particularly since the start of this millennium, there's been a dramatic decline in inter-regional mobility in the US. And as a result, people are no longer job searching outside their regions, particularly people with relatively modest skills. As a result, they have become sort of spatially captive. And that is, I think, part of the thing that you're alluding to, this fomenting of distrust and anger. So I think what you're doing is absolutely wonderful. It scares the hell out of me, but thank you for doing it.
Yeah, should I collect or should I reply?
Why don't you reply, and we're going to collect a few more because it's a very, very important topic here.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. I think you're making your points are spot on. There's a massive, significant change in the role of the media, and I agree with that, especially on television. This idea that now you can become as media completely partisan, which was not the case 20, 25 years ago. And the rise of social media, where, of course, you as a group mingle with the people you agree with and ignore everything else. So that probably has played a role, and I think is fundamental. It's something that I don't study. It's not my area. I'll leave it for others. But just to be a devil's advocate, I'm just going to highlight in Europe, we haven't gone down that route. We still got the social media that is probably less used, although it's widespread, but less used than in the case of the US. But for example, television, still you have got electoral commissions and electoral committees that decide airtime on a proportional basis for parties. And nevertheless, our societies in Europe have also become much more polarized than they were just 2 decades ago, with also the complete fragmentation and destruction of party systems that were established in the case of France, in the case of Italy, increasingly moving in that direction in the case of the US and the case of Spain. So in that respect, media might play a role, but there are a lot of other factors behind that. And of course, the decline of mobility, I think, is fundamental in this. You highlighted, I think, the factors, the paper by Rickman and Partridge, that I should look at it again. The fact that increasingly people in declining areas are stuck there. And they might be stuck there for 3 reasons. The first one is negative equity. If your place has been declining and you invested in a house, you invested in property, you cannot sell that property and you cannot move to a city like, for example, the Bay Area or Los Angeles, where prices are completely unaffordable for anyone living there, let alone anyone coming from the Midwest or anywhere else. The polarization of skills. The fact that the people that are often remaining in this area are the people with the lowest skills, very often with high school diploma and incapable of moving elsewhere to compete at the high end, but also to compete at the low end of jobs with migrants that can do those jobs probably better and for a lower salary and perhaps illegally in some ways. And the third is that many people don't want to live. They have got don't want to leave the places where they were born and grew up. They got their social capital, they got their family, they got their friends, they got their lives. They got very pleasant, because many of these places, what you still have got is, although they are declining, is a relatively good quality of life. And therefore, they might be unhappy at the way things are going. They might think, my children are not going to have the same prospects. I'm not having the same prospects that my parents had. My children are not going to have. But nevertheless, they might be unhappy, but they don't want to live, because where they live or where they were born, they got their own life, and they got their social networks and social capital.
So very good point, Andres. You know, it kind of goes back to one element I discussed in my answer to you. I'm very curious as to whether that increasing cost of higher education is to some extent hurting that mobility you indicated, also making people choose a specific network to get their news from, as Jeff has highlighted. Yeah, I don't have a good sense of whether that cost has increased more in the US than I would say in the UK. Certainly on continental Europe, the cost has not increased that much compared to what it was, say, 20, 30 years ago. So it could be a factor.
Well, in the UK it has, but it's still much lower than in the US. And you're absolutely right. I didn't answer that point before, and apologies for that. It does make a difference. In the US, you have a clear hierarchy of universities. That hierarchy is reflected in the cost of universities. And very often that is also reflected not just in the cost, but in employment prospects for graduates. If you go to, and I hope no one gets offended there, but let's say Amarillo Community College, and or go to Harvard, your job and employment prospects are radically different. And of course, there is traditionally Americans move to universities, and those that remain at local universities are very often those that cannot afford or have got the worst grades. That's not the case in Europe. In Europe, the hierarchy of universities, although with the rankings, is increasingly becoming polarized and trying to identify which are the best. But normally the tradition was that people went to their local university. And in most of continental Europe and in the UK, until relatively recently, universities were free or relatively free or had a very low cost. And that helped keeping talent and create a situation whereby, in theory, you would have less territorial inequality. Having said that, the irony is that territorial disparities across the US are lower than they are across Europe, where the differences within countries, but also across countries, are far greater in terms of inequalities, not in the evolution of inequalities, which is interesting, than in the case of the US, where you have a much higher level of interpersonal inequality, especially within large cities, but a much lower, in fact, the lowest among the 85 countries for which I got data on territorial inequality, together with Australia, in terms of territorial or regional inequalities, if you want.
Thank you so much, Andres. I think that it really means that we as educators still have quite a lot of work ahead of us, but it really makes gives even more meaning to the profession that we are in. So with that, I think we're going to close for today. So Andre, thank you so much for your presentation. Laura, thank you so much also for your presentation. And I really hope to see all of you next week, same place and same time. Muchísimas gracias. Muito obrigado. Ciao, everyone.
Gracias. Thank you very much. And well, all the best, and hope to see you in better times in person.